Let me just go ahead and start off by saying that imposter syndrome has me in a choke hold. It's had me in a chokehold for a while, but right now it's got me in a chokehold body slam combo. I'm fighting for my life out here, okay? What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Hood Soft Life Podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina, and in this podcast, we talk about navigating the challenges that come with growing up in the hood and leaving those challenges behind for a soft life. Growing up in the hood has its own set of challenges, but what people don't tend to tell you is not only do those challenges follow you once you've made it out physically, but they tend to intensify. So, I'm bringing you along on my journey. I'm going to be honest with you about the struggles and the lessons that I'm learning to achieve a soft life. In this episode, we're going to be talking about imposter syndrome. What does it look like? And more specifically, the difference between imposter syndrome in a traditional 9-to-5 and imposter syndrome in the entrepreneurial realm. So, let's get started. All right, y'all, let's talk about it. What is imposter syndrome? Essentially, what imposter syndrome is the persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own efforts and skills. So essentially, you feel like you do not belong in the rooms that you belong in because of your own hard work, because you're smart enough, because you're good enough. You feel like you only were able to get to those places because of luck. It had nothing to do with you. It had nothing to do with your hard work. It had nothing to do with your knowledge or your capabilities. It's just how it worked out. And so when you're struggling with feelings of imposter syndrome, research shows that it's also tied with feelings of anxiety and depression. And it makes a lot of sense. Think about it. If you don't feel like you're smart enough, you're good enough, you're capable enough to achieve the things that you want to achieve, you are going to feel like everywhere you go, you're a fake, you're a phony, you just got there from luck, and it's only a matter of time before somebody sees that you don't belong here. And that becomes your biggest fear when you're struggling with imposter syndrome. You are worried that other people will confirm that you do not belong in the space that you belong in. Let me provide you with a personal example. When I started college and throughout my entire journey, but especially at the beginning, I had a lot of imposter syndrome because I was just a young Afro-Latina from poverty who didn't know shit about going to college. One person in my family had gone, and that was over 20 years ago. So this is a whole new ball game. This is a whole new different field. And they cannot answer my questions about college, right? They cannot guide me in the way that would be beneficial for me in the path that I am on now 20 years later. And so I felt like it was only a matter of time before people saw I'm not smart enough. I'm not good enough. I don't deserve to be here. And what I will say, right, is I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychological expert of any kind. But what I will say is that imposter syndrome is definitely tied to your own self-worth, your own self-efficacy, essentially whether or not you believe you can achieve the things that you want to. And so therefore, you have to do the work to undo those thoughts. Those thoughts are solely personal, and I'm going to get to that a little bit further on. But those thoughts are solely personal, and there's proof that those thoughts are not true. So, because I was struggling with so much imposter syndrome when I first started college, I was doing a lot to overcompensate for that feeling. I had 2 majors, 2 minors, and a concentration, so 5 points of study while I was in college. I joined clubs. I founded my own club. I was on the board of trustees at school, so essentially I helped the board of trustees make decisions about the school. I had 3 jobs, because I had to financially if I was going to be able to stay in school and if I was going to be able to pay for the things that I wanted to pay for. I did a bunch of different things to try and feel like if I can have 20 different things on my plate on top of going to class every day, and if I can have good grades, have these 20 things on my plate and juggle them all and make sure that they're all going well, that they're all being perfect, then I can prove that I belong here. I can prove that I belong in college. I can prove that I'm smart enough, that I'm good enough, that I'm capable enough. And it caused a lot of problems for my mental health. And we're going to get to that in the next part of the episode. Let's be real. Let's talk about it. Mental health is something that is very taboo. There's a lot of ups and downs with mental health. There's a lot of things that we're still learning as a society about mental health and the importance of it. So when I was in college and when I was going through imposter syndrome, we had a bunch of things going on in the world, right? We had COVID, a global pandemic that fucked everybody over. We had the Black Lives Matter movement having attention drawn to it because of a bunch of police brutality that was happening with George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. all the stuff that was going on with that, people were starting to really see what the importance of mental health was about, because now we're being put in isolation, forced into an isolation that none of us were expecting, none of us could have ever prepared for. And so we were starting to see the problems with mental health. And all of those things hit me all at once during this time in 2020. And so I already had my issues with imposter syndrome and my self-worth and my self-belief about whether or not I would be successful in college. Then on top of that, I had mental health issues prior to going to college. I had them for a while, and they were just growing as I was in college. Now we have the reality of what it's like to live as a person of color in the United States of America being put on display for everybody to see in full effect, for lack of a better word, right? And that was necessary, right? I think it was very necessary for the world to see how challenging it is to be a person of color in the U.S., the realness of it, the difficulties of it, and understand that this is what we have to go through. These are the things that we have to worry about. And so I understand like why that happened, but all three of those things, my mental health, my imposter syndrome, and then the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 specifically, all those things piling together affected me in a huge way. And so my imposter syndrome was very much tied to whether or not I would be a successful person of color. I cannot take away the fact that I'm a woman of color. I can't take away the fact that I'm an Afro-Latina. That's never going to change. And so my biggest thing was that when I went to college, the plan was to become a lawyer. The plan was that I would go through the 4 years of college, I would graduate, I would immediately go to law school, and I would become a successful lawyer. And I had plans of going to not just any regular school for law. No, I wanted to go to like an Ivy League or a school with a big name brand, something that would provide me with prestige or basically be like a stamp of approval for that, right? So I wanted to go to a Harvard or a Stanford or a Howard or a Georgetown, whatever. And the goal was essentially like if I went through the college and then I went through the law school and then I became a successful lawyer on the other end of it, that was supposed to protect me from police brutality. That was supposed to protect me from racism and racial inequity in the U.S. when we all know that that's not true. We all know that that is not real. There's no such thing as protection from these types of issues, these types of racial experiences. And so at the time, I didn't really think that way. I just assumed that if I became a successful lawyer, if I became quote unquote, this is going to be harsh to say, and it's not that I believe this, but this is what I felt like I was hearing at the time. If I became useful to society, quote unquote, that I would be safe. And that's not to say that the people who were harmed by police brutality, the people who were harmed by racial inequity were not useful to society. I am not saying that at all. And it took me a long time to understand that, like, it does not matter if I'm a successful lawyer. It does not matter what path I take to get to where I want to be in my career. If somebody wants to perpetuate that type of racial injustice, that type of violence on me for solely what I look like as a person, they will do it. And so I was struggling a lot with the anxiety that comes with trying to essentially be perfect and make sure that nobody notices that I'm a quote unquote fraud. And I was struggling with the anxiety of being a person of color. And at the time, my brain combined the two, and I was working extra hard to overcompensate for that and feel like if I did this, I'll be safe from racial injustice. If I do this, I'll be safe from police brutality. And that's not true. That's not real. There's no such thing. And it is a harsh thing to talk about. It is a harsh reality to experience. But what I will say is that regardless of what your goals and your dreams are, whether you want to be a lawyer, a doctor, a fucking painter, whatever, right? And you're a person of color, you do not have to feel like your sense of self-worth or your protection is tied to your job and your career path. Do whatever is going to make you happy with reason, right? Don't be out here doing some crazy stuff and then say that I said to do what makes you happy, right? Do what's going to make you happy and what you think is going to best benefit your community, your society in the way that you want to, and understand that how you go about doing that and your racial and ethnic identity, your identity as a human being in general, has nothing to do with the two. There are some places in the world, or there's some careers paths where the two will combine, right? I started this podcast because of my racial and ethnic identity, because of where I grew up, and the goal essentially is to bring awareness to that. I have dreams and aspirations of pursuing a career path that will allow me to tie my identity to making the world a better place. But if you don't want to do that, you don't have to. And also, on top of that, what you do for work is not tied to your self-worth. And I need to say that again. What you do for work is not tied to your self-worth. If you feel like you're the shit, you're good enough, you're smart enough, and this, that, and a third, and you're a painter, hey, then you're the shit, you're good enough, you're smart enough, and you're the painter. If you don't feel like you're the shit, you're smart enough, you're good enough, whatever, and you're a successful doctor, that's going to start showing up in your work. And I'm going to be a little bit scared if you come touching me, talking about something, let me draw your blood, and you're not too sure about what you're doing. I'm going to be a little bit nervous about that. So your self-worth is not tied to your job. Work on your self-worth first, because your self-worth is going to affect how you perform at your job. But just because you're a lawyer or a doctor or you're a pilot or whatever does not automatically mean that you feel like you're the shit, like you're a good person, that you're good enough, that you're smart enough. And if you do not feel that way, you're going to be spending a lot of time trying to overcompensate for that feeling. And that may or may not, it really just depends on who you are, show up in how you perform at work. And you need to decide, are you okay with that showing up at work? Yes or no? Let's go ahead and talk about the difference between struggling with imposter syndrome in a 9-to-5 and struggling with imposter syndrome on the entrepreneurial route. I do want to make the quick disclaimer that I'm not a full-time entrepreneur. I'm just getting started on that route, so I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I know the ups, downs, lefts, and rights of being an entrepreneur. I do not yet, but I'm just going to provide my perspective of what it's like as I begin the journey. So anyway, at the time of recording this, at the time of this being out, I'm going to be working a traditional 9-to-5. I have a boss. I go to work in a building every single day. I have the traditional 9-to-5, and I work in education. And the difference between struggling with imposter syndrome in a 9-to-5 is that you have somebody else that you need to answer to. You have somebody else that is going to be watching over your work, that's going to be telling you what to do. Are you doing it right? Are you doing it wrong? They're basically going to be evaluating your work. I will say that this does have a benefit when you're struggling with imposter syndrome, because ideally that person is going to be making sure that you're taking the steps that you need to be successful in your role. Whether or not you believe that you achieve that success on your own is a whole different topic. But essentially that person is going to be training you to make sure that you do the things that you're supposed to be doing. They're going to be answering the questions that you have. They're going to be making sure that the work is getting done in the way that the company wants it. The hard part about struggling with imposter syndrome in a 9-to-5 is that your job is dependent on whether or not you can produce that work. And if you feel like you can't produce good work and that starts showing up in your work, now you're worried about, can you keep your job? On top of that, you have somebody that you need to answer to. You have somebody who is going to be evaluating your performance. And if you feel like you're not good enough, you either are on the end where you overcompensate for that by picking up extra things that you know you can't have on your plate, or it's showing up in your work where it's like you don't take initiative, you feel uncomfortable with certain things that you're being asked to do. It's just overall showing in your work you're not growing, you're not flourishing, you're not being successful in the way that the company is looking for. And then the third thing is that your fear that your supervisors and your coworkers will see you as a fraud is more confined, but those are the people that are around you every day. So working at a 9-to-5 and you're struggling with imposter syndrome, everybody else that you work with in that space can see, in your mind, can see whether or not you're achieving the things you're supposed to be doing or not. Those people are in front of you every single day. So you pretty much have to put on that facade or overcompensate for your feelings in front of all these people every day, all day long, for 8 hours a day. Now, if you are working as an entrepreneur or if you're on the entrepreneurial route, there is a lot of imposter syndrome that comes with that, at least for me and my experience. Again, I'm just beginning this journey, so I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I know what it's like to be a full-time entrepreneur. I have no idea. Not yet, anyway. But what I will say, as somebody who is starting to make the strides to get to where I want to be, this is when I feel like I'm feeling the most imposter syndrome of all time, because my podcast is growing. The business that I want to create is growing, and I'm starting from nothing. And I feel like when we live in a society where there are people who blow up on social media overnight, and that's not happening for you, you start to have a lot of these questions of like, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? Is what you're doing worth it? Are you good enough to achieve that, etc.? The other thing that's hard about it is that I have people who are listening to this podcast, or who will see it on YouTube, who will see it on Instagram, TikTok, whatever. They'll see it and they'll have no idea who I am, and they get to see whether or not I'll achieve the things that I want to, or whether or not I won't. And it's not necessarily that I care about their opinion, but it's more so like there's more eyes than just the 20 other people at your office that you work with. There's more eyes on what it is that you're doing. There's more eyes on whether or not you fail. And so now you feel like you have to overcompensate for all the extra eyes, because if you do fail in front of, let's say, 1,000 people, how is that going to impact your business? How is that going to impact the way people view you? Whatever. And again, it's all about what you make it. Like, if you are somebody whose brand is built on, like, you're going to watch me fail, you're going to watch me fall on my face and get back up and do it again, then there's nothing to worry about. But if your brand is not built on that, then there's a lot to worry about. The other thing is, like, even though there are a lot of people nowadays that want to be an entrepreneur, including myself, because you want that freedom over your time, you want that freedom over your life, you want to be able to dictate how your business moves, etc., and how you contribute to society. That's all cool and that's great and that's dandy, but also, like, everything falls on you now. When you have a business, and I'm just thinking about this as I move forward and what it'll look like for me in the future. When you have a business, everything falls on you. The success of your business, the failure of your business, whether or not you make money, whether or not you can afford to pay your employees if you make enough money. Everything falls on you, and that's a lot of pressure to put on one person who is or is not ready for it. It really just depends. And so there are a lot of things that you have to overcompensate for. And while I'm new to this journey, I do want to share some of the things that I'm feeling in the beginner phase with this imposter syndrome as somebody who's on the entrepreneurial route. So some of the things that I'm feeling are fear of failure. I am very afraid of failure for this podcast, not because of a superficial reason of like, I feel like I need to be successful, like it's going to provide validation for me, but I'm worried that if I fail at this, how is that going to impact like future things that I want to do, future business ventures. And so I know that the point of this podcast is to provide help for people who are on the same path that I'm currently on. Not necessarily like you're from the hood, but it's like, like there are extra challenges or extra burdens to your path to getting to a soft life, a successful life. And so I want to be able to provide a platform for that. And my fear is that if this is not successful, that I may not be the person who is capable of doing that, which leads to my next point. Am I enough? Is my journey enough to provide help for people? That is something that I'm really struggling with my imposter syndrome right now, is feeling like I haven't gone through enough life yet to be able to speak on what I'm talking about. When in reality, I've been through a lot in 23, almost 24 years of life. And while I feel sometimes that I have enough to say, there are a lot of times where I feel like I'm too young to be telling people what to do with their lives. Not necessarily what to do. Let me take that back. I feel like I'm too young to provide other people with advice on how to be successful because I'm not even where I want to be yet. Another thing that I'm really worried about is fear of change. I'm not even going to lie. I'm somebody who really does struggle with big changes. It uproots my entire life for me, even if it's just something as simple of like moving like 30 minutes away. That's a lot for me. I'm not really somebody who is here for change like that. I do believe that it's important though. But my worry is like, let's say for example, I get to where I want to be with the life that I want to have. What does that mean for this podcast? What does that mean for the family members and the loved ones that I have? What does that mean for me? Where do I go from there? And I think that's what I'm worried about. I guess it's two things. I'm worried about change, and I'm worried about the fear of the unknown. And then the last thing I'll say is that I'm worried about not being able to give myself the freedom that I'm looking for My entire life, I always wanted to be able to have something that I never thought was even possible. I wanted to be able to have a real home, what I feel like is a home for me. I wanted to be able to travel the world. I wanted to be able to have freedom over my life and over my time. I wanted to be able to make a lot of money, not necessarily because making money is important for me, but because of the freedom that is attached to that. The idea of being able to create a legacy and generational wealth was always important to me, even when I didn't even know what that really meant. But my fear is that I'll never be able to give myself that if this doesn't go well, or if just in general. I feel like I'm worried about, like, if I cannot give myself that, what does that mean for me? And I will say that whether or not I can achieve that sense of freedom is tied to a lot of my future plans, like whether or not I'll be able to get married, whether or not I'll be able to have children and build the life that I want to on a personal level. My fears around my business are very much tied to my personal life and whether or not I'll be able to move forward in the next steps of my personal life. Because for me, in order to be able to provide for the family that I want to, in the way that I want to, these things with my business need to be set off and going first. I can't tell you if you'll ever be able to fully eliminate imposter syndrome. Everybody's imposter syndrome looks different. Everybody's experience with imposter syndrome is very different. And again, I'm not a psychological expert of any kind, but what I will say is that imposter syndrome is very much so tied to your own self-worth and your beliefs about yourself. But what I will say is that there are some tips that I have to be able to minimize your imposter syndrome. Again, it's a personal journey. Everybody else might need to do a little remix to this how they see fit. But here are the 4 things that I would suggest to help you eliminate imposter syndrome. So number 1 is calling out the imposter syndrome as soon as you recognize it. Number 2, talk about it with people that you can genuinely trust. Get that off your chest, get that out on paper, do whatever it is that you got to do, but address it and talk about it. Number 3, go to therapy if you can, whether that's group therapy or solo therapy. And I'm always going to say, if you can't afford to go to therapy, I completely understand. The next best thing to do is definitely going to be shadow work. And number 4 is replace the limiting beliefs that are feeding your imposter syndrome with proof of your affirmations, proof that you are enough, proof that you are good enough, etc. So I just want to put this into play for you, an example of what I've come up with. So let's say I'm feeling imposter syndrome regarding my podcast. I don't feel like I'm smart enough to talk about the things I'm talking about. I don't feel like I'm good enough to be able to produce the type of health that I'm looking forward to. So number 1, the first thing I'm going to do is recognize that I have that thought of feeling like I'm not good enough to be able to guide others. And so I've acknowledged it. I've addressed it. I've called it out like, okay, I know that this is a problem. I know that this is a limiting belief that I have. Number 2, I'm going to talk about it with somebody that I can genuinely trust. And 9 times out of 10, I know exactly who I'm calling right away when I'm feeling like this. And I'm either going to call my aunts, I'm going to call my mentors, or I have specific friends that I'm going to call when I'm feeling this, because I know that without asking, they're going to reassure me in that moment of like, but you've done X, Y, and Z, but you are this, that, and a third. Look at how you've achieved this, that, and a third. For somebody who is struggling with self-worth, you want to be careful about how much you take this in, because you don't want it to be that you cannot operate without their approval. You just want it to be a reminder of like, oh yeah, I am that bitch, I'm the shit. And just remind yourself, because there are things that you've done that you're going to forget about or feel super basic to you, but your loved ones are looking at you like, I can't believe that you did that. I'm so proud of you. And sometimes that's all you need to hear is just a quick little reminder of like, oh yeah, that's right, I did do that. And now you're feeling a little bit more motivated and you're feeling a little bit more positive. Number 3, I'm able to see a therapist bi-weekly. I'm thankful to have the funds to be able to do that. I didn't for a long time. And so these are things that I talk about with my therapist on a consistent basis, because it's not something that is going to go away overnight. That is something I need everybody to understand. Imposter syndrome is not going to go away overnight. It's not going to go away in a month. It's not even going to go away in a year, if I'm going to be completely honest with you. At least that's my experience. That's my journey. Is going to take time, and allow it to take time. But what I can say is that as you continue to address the issues that you're struggling with in regards to imposter syndrome, in regards to self-worth, is that you start to notice a difference in how you respond to those things. I've been working on this for a little bit of time, and while I will say that imposter syndrome is definitely something that's really, really heavy for me, especially as I step into this new role of trying to become an entrepreneur, I can address now that when I have a problem, I can address it head on. I can see that there's a change. Before, I would just ruminate. I would just agree with the thoughts that were going through it, that I was going through, and I would pretty much try to validate those negative thoughts and just be like, "Yep, I shouldn't do this, that, and the third because I'm not smart enough. I'm not good enough." And then it would really kill my self-esteem. It would really kill my mental health. But now I listen to that. I'd be like, we're not doing this today. We don't have time for this today. I know that I'm the shit. I know that I'm smart enough. I know that I'm going to be able to achieve the things that I want to achieve. And I'm not going to sit here and say that it wipes away all your problems, but it allows you to understand that in that moment, you have now addressed that issue and you are convincing yourself that you are enough. You're reminding yourself that you're enough. We all need reminders. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. We all need reminders about something, and it's okay to need a reminder of you are the shit, you are all that in a bag of chips and whatever. And number 4 is replacing the limiting beliefs that you have with proof that you can do the things that you want to. So it's like, okay, my podcast is small. My podcast is just starting to grow, and I'm okay with that. I'm not in a rush to blow up overnight. But now I'm going to provide myself with the reassurance of like, oh, I don't feel like my podcast is growing by looking at some of the messages that I get about my podcast where people say that they're learning more or that they're understanding their self-worth more or that they're starting to do things that are necessary to achieve their goals and how it's impacting them in a positive way. That to me is more than enough. Just having those conversations with people where they can tell me like, I really appreciate what you said about X, Y, and Z on your podcast because now I'm doing X, Y, and Z and it's been a positive impact on me. That helps me a lot because it reassures me that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. There's proof that I am good enough to provide that advice. I am smart enough to provide the education. I am enough to be able to put the production together, and it's not picture perfect and it's not clean like that in the way that I imagined it in my head, and that's okay. But people are getting what they need to out of it. They enjoy listening to the content, and I'm okay with that. Before I go ahead and talk about our affirmation for the week, I just want to provide everybody with that reassurance of like, every single time I turn on this camera or I turn on this mic, I am hit with a brick of imposter syndrome. And I'm very uncomfortable when I first turn on the camera. It takes multiple takes, it takes multiple tries, and I'm more than okay with that. I understand that it's not going to be perfect, but when you're trying to achieve the thing that you want to achieve in this life, you have to look fear in the face every fucking day and be like, okay, I'm going to do what I want to do. Because if you don't look the fear in the face, if you don't try to achieve the things that you want to achieve, you're going to be stagnant and you're going to be dissatisfied with that as well. And you're going to be constantly thinking about the what ifs. What if I did this? What if I did that? Where would I be now if I had pursued my dream? If you fall on your face, get the hell up and try again. And it's okay. There are going to be plenty of times where I fuck up. There have been times where I have messed things up, where I didn't produce things the way that I wanted to. I've made mistakes. There's nothing wrong with making mistakes. When you make the mistakes, you give yourself an opportunity to learn. You give yourself an opportunity to grow. You give yourself an opportunity to be one step closer to where you want to be. So all I'm going to say is that, like, embrace the imposter syndrome journey and eliminating that imposter syndrome or getting rid of it altogether. Embrace that journey because you're going to see this huge change in yourself and you're going to be able to see that you were already capable of achieving the things that you wanted to achieve when you first started out in this journey of addressing your imposter syndrome and minimizing it. But now you're going to see the huge difference in yourself now that you've stepped out of that or you've minimized the imposter syndrome to a point where it's extremely manageable for you. You're going to see that you were capable when you started and you're more than capable now. And if anything, it doesn't hinder you at all in the way that you move about life, in the way that you move about the things that you want to achieve in this world, because you have control over it. You were always smart enough. You were always good enough. You were always more than capable enough. Despite what the voices in your head were telling you, despite what you felt like, you were always capable of doing so. And now that you've eliminated the imposter syndrome, imagine how it's going to feel, how light you're going to feel knowing I'm the shit. I can do what I want to do, and there's no reason for me to second guess it or overcompensate, work to the bone for no reason, because I was always able to do it. So I just want you to keep that in mind. Like, imposter syndrome, this is going to be a journey trying to eliminate it. You are capable right now, and you're still going to be capable once you make the move out of it, once you shift out of it. But you're going to see this drastic change in yourself, and it's going to develop the character, and you can't sleep on that. You can't pretend like that's not important. It's very, very important to get you to where you want to be. All right, we are at that point in the episode where it's time for the affirmation for the week. And the affirmation for this week is, I am good enough. I am smart enough. I am enough. I belong in the rooms that I want to see myself in. So, I'm going to go ahead and repeat that 3 times. If you have the ability to close your eyes, close your eyes. If you want to write this down, you can do that. However you want to speak this onto your life, find a way to do that. So, I am good enough. I am smart enough. I am enough. I belong in the rooms I want to see myself in. I am good enough. I am smart enough. I am enough. I belong in the rooms I want to see myself in. I am good enough. I am smart enough. I am enough. I belong in the rooms I want to see myself in. All right, y'all, that's all I had for today's episode. Before I go ahead and close this out, I really just want to take a moment to thank you for listening on whatever platform it is that you're listening on. This podcast really does allow me to be vulnerable, and it allows me to heal and just talk about some of the realness of growing up in the hood and the challenges that come with that. Some of these challenges are not specific to the hood at all. So I just really wanted to thank you for allowing me to have a space where I can be vulnerable with that, and where you guys are able to tell me how the podcast is impacting you in a positive way. And I really appreciate that. I hope that the podcast is helpful to people who are listening to it in a way that's beneficial for you. And I hope that you don't feel like you're being singled out because you didn't grow up in the hood or whatever. This podcast is for anybody who's trying to achieve a soft life, regardless of where you came from. But I am going to tailor it for my people from the hood, because it is an extra challenge. I also want to just take a moment to acknowledge that there is a lot of intersectionality that comes with the topics that I'm talking about and my racial and ethnic identity. And so I put a lot of love into that specifically for my people of color, because there are not a lot of spaces that do that for us, or not enough spaces that do that for us. And so that'll always be my number one priority, is to create an extra space for my people of color. But I do want to help as many people as possible achieve a soft life. So with that being said, let me know what you thought about today's episode. What did you think about the topic of imposter syndrome? Are you struggling with imposter syndrome? You can DM me privately on Instagram at the HSL Pod if you're comfortable with doing that instead of leaving a public comment. You can go ahead and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the HSL Pod, and then Spotify and YouTube at the Hood Soft Life Podcast. I'm going to catch you on the next one.